Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Head Foundation. I trust you're all off to a grand beginning this new Chinese New Year. For those of you who are new to our events, my name is David Clegg. I am the Managing Director of the Foundation, as well as of a very talented group of colleagues that I'm proud to be affiliated with. The Head Foundation is an education think tank and an international charitable foundation based here in Singapore. We focus on the fields of education and leadership and the role that each plays in the development of societies, in particular here in Asia. Our research, publications work, events, programs, and projects aim to have some influence on education policy for the region. Our public lecture series is just one of the many platforms we utilize to inform, involve, and hopefully to impact in some manner. This evening, we are thrilled to have with us Professor Gopinathan. Many of you here tonight know him already. Gopi has quickly endeared himself with all of us here at the Foundation. He has that way about him. Professor Gopinathan has been an instrumental figure in the evolution of education here in Singapore. He is the former Dean of the National Institute of Education and currently Adjunct Professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. His published works and principled manner have left a lasting impression on many and an impact on the education of a nation. Education remains fundamental to a healthy and sustainable society. And it has been and always will be about relationships between teacher and student, parent and child, school and home, a nation, and its citizenry. All woven together to form a stronger fabric for a greater society. And all good relationships begin with a conversation. It was a conversation last year that changed the course of one man's path and the fortunes of a newly formed think tank. Gopi is Senior Advisor to the Head Foundation, where his youthful spirit and that tune he hums to himself while moving through life continues to both entertain and enlighten those who are fortunate to come across his path. And isn't that how it goes, really? Just when you think you know all there is to know, the learning continues. I believe we're in for a bit of an education this evening. So without further ado, back from what he called retirement and what we know as simply the next chapter in a meaningful life story, please join me in welcoming our esteemed colleague and friend, Professor Gopinathan.
Switched on, right? Yeah. Thank you, David, for those kind words. As you say, retirement isn't quite what it's made out to be, because you end up being busier than ever. But if it is useful and if it is fun work, then I think it's worth the while. Let me also thank you, as David did, for coming this evening. When I was preparing this talk, I was wondering whether there would be yet another talk that I wanted to give on Singapore education, having given talks on Singapore education over a 40-year period. And I didn't know there was an appetite for more. But you all are here, and so I guess education is something that we are very concerned with and something that we will want to be thinking about. I'm conscious of the fact that it is, of course, the 50th anniversary of Singapore. And what better year than to take stock of education, which has been so central in the development of Singapore, in the development of Singapore society, Singapore individuals, and Singaporean nation. A good time to think back on where we were in 1965, how far we have come, and yet with the consciousness of how much has been achieved, to also look forward to what remains to be done and how we should be able to take the Singapore education story forward. So 50 years in 50 minutes. Fasten your seatbelts, okay? I'd like to start with a little biographical references, because I like to think that the Singapore education story is my story writ small in some ways, or the Singapore story writ large. A lot of what I'm going to say is also a reflection of the journey that I've made through Singapore education and in Singapore education. I am the son of Indian migrants who came to Singapore in the 40s, seeking work, seeking employment. My parents spoke no English, and it was good fortune that I was born at the time I was born, because the 50s was a period of expansion of education, particularly English medium education. That expansion of education, and particularly the expansion and the opportunity to access English medium education, was fundamental to the social mobility that so many people in my generation experienced. And if you think about the policies that were responsible for this expansion, they had to do with two things. They had to do with the economic, and they had to do with the social. The economic dimension was clearly a question about whether Singapore, poor, ex-colonial, resource-starved, could survive viably. A question one could have asked in 1956, and one could have asked again, and did ask in 1965. Could we survive? Could we make it as an independent nation? Language was central to my growing up. In fact, I'm supposed to be officially trilingual because I had English medium education. I learned Tamil as a second language. And when I was a teacher in 1968, I had to pass Malay as Standard 1. So I was trilingual. I'm no longer trilingual. I'm effectively monolingual. And we'll talk a little bit about that. With regard to identity, who was I? Well, the former PM Lee used to say that he listened to 3 national anthems. I'm in that generation. I listened to 3 national anthems. I probably didn't quite make out the Japanese national anthem, but I was alive then. And of course, it was the Malaysian national anthem and then the Singaporean national anthem. What does that say about identity? What does that say about who I am, where I belong, what my sense of citizenship is? And finally, in terms of identity, taking all this in consideration, if somebody asked me who I was, I guess I would say Singaporean Indian. And I will reflect a little bit on what education and education policies were responsible for the way I think about things. My concern with education has always been to ask the question, can education build a new and just social order? 40 years ago, I published this. This was from my master's thesis. And what I merely like you to look at is the title. It was Towards a National System of Education in Singapore. And the word national is deliberate, and it has informed my thinking about education and the role of the state in the provision of education. Last year, I had the good fortune to be able to publish a collection of my essays, and the title is Education and the Nation State. So the nation state, the capacity of the state, the responsibility of the state to provide for education is central to the ways in which I've taught and I've researched and I've argued the cause of education. So with those preliminary remarks, we'll get on to the slides that I have. I can turn this around. So, largely structured around 4 components. Education as a foundation for socio-economic transformation. That should not surprise anyone. It's central to the ways that education is positioned in the post-colonial and contemporary world. I want to focus more on the challenges that education and the Singapore education system faces in the context of globalization, and in particular to look at some of the consequences of the policies that we have had. So challenges to the existing education policies, and then we'll have an open discussion about some of the aspects, some of the things that I've raised, and your own responses to what the points I've made, and either your agreement or disagreement. Two fundamental questions. What role did education play in Singapore's transformation? In that current phrase, from third world to first world. What challenges awaited in the era of globalization? Post-war Singapore, 1945 to 1965. Looking back, we tend to think of 1965 as being crucial. I don't think 1965 is as crucial as the immediate post-war period. True, there were challenges in 1965, but post-war Singapore between 1945 and 1965 were where or when some of the foundational decisions about the nature of the society and the nation to be were laid down. What were the challenges that faced us? It was an age of vulnerability and uncertainty. For those of you who know the Singapore education story from the broad historical sweep, you will know that Singapore under colonial rule had a four-medium system of education. It was a segmented, segregated system with enormous social and political consequences. In fact, it was basically the discontent, the alienation that the Chinese educated felt, very largely the Chinese educated, but one could say broadly the non-English educated, that was fundamental to thinking about this question of survival, of legitimacy, of growth, of sustainability, right? The second point, you all know that, resource-starved, poor, high unemployment, mistrust within and between communities. Why within? Because the larger component of the population was a Chinese ethnic group, and they were divided between the English educated and the non-English educated, right? Segmented education system, hostility between English and non-English educated. And 9th August 1965, we didn't want to be independent. We had a number of choices, not all of which were palatable, but ultimate decision was to go our own way, which is why I call it a reluctant statehood, a reluctant nation. Many nations strive to be independent and sovereign. The paradox of Singapore is that it didn't want to be independent on its own terms because of the vulnerability that was central to the way that we were thinking about it. And thinking about it now, what is the fundamental cause for separation? I would argue that the fundamental cause for separation was that the Malaysians chose to have a system, a polity built on special privileges, while Singapore chose the meritocratic route. These were fundamental divisions. But if we look forward 50 years down the line, it will be useful to think of the consequences that have followed. To the extent that we have, for example, a unified system when we were very segmented and segregated as a result of a policy of deliberately making education the sort of motherboard for socialization, for identity building, for multiracial and ethnic harmony. The Malaysian system today, 50 years on, continues to be a segmented and segregated system with tremendous consequences for social cohesion, for inter-ethnic harmony in Malaysia. But has our meritocratic system been an unqualified success, unalloyed success, or are there some consequences with meritocracy that we ought to be looking at, which is, I think, one of the things that would be important to be thinking about. What then transformed a poor, resource-starved Singapore into the economic powerhouse that we have, one of the wealthiest countries in terms of per capita GDP today? I think the framework that I found most useful to thinking about this is the framework of the developmental state. And by that I mean an awareness that to some extent the crisis of legitimacy, the crisis of making it in the modern world needed a commitment to economic growth. I'm particularly thinking of countries like South Korea, Taiwan, of Hong Kong, and of Singapore, the 4 developmental states, at least in East Asia. What is common with those 4 states? They all faced a crisis of legitimacy. They all were called into question as to whether they were legitimate states. Why do I say that? Well, even today, South Korea has problems with North Korea. Will a unified Korea emerge? Taiwan is seen as a renegade province of mainland China. Will there be some reconciliation? But there are, from time to time, potential hostilities that can break out between the 2 countries. Hong Kong always knew that it had to go back to China, even though some are questioning whether or not this ought to be the case. But there's always a sense of insecurity. Who were we? And Singapore, 1965, this reluctant statehood I talked about. All 4 countries, states, you call it, had this problem of legitimizing their existence. And all of them chose, in fact, there may not have been a choice, to go down the economic prosperity path. So the economic dimension, the growth that would legitimate their survival as a state, would provide the resources for education, for health, for housing, for transportation. All this was central. And in all these countries, you see a very utilitarian approach to education, that it was principally an instrument for economic growth, for economic development. True, social issues were important, and perhaps no more important than in Singapore, because largely Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong were relatively homogeneous. They didn't have the plurality that Singapore had. So the Singapore challenge was much greater than the challenge for the other 3 states. All right, so for us, both economic development and social cohesion were fundamental objectives of the education system. And the system is either a failure or a success depending on how well it met those 2 fundamental goals. So education is a linking of education goals to economic needs. And very quickly, if you look at it in comparison with Latin America, if you look at it in comparison with Africa, universal primary education was very quickly achieved. And on that foundation, we were able to build relevant and flexible post-primary education, particularly the insertion of technical and vocational education to build the skills and the technology that would contribute to the industrialization phase that many of these countries entered into very quickly. So the developmental state framework is a useful way of thinking about the urgency, the single-mindedness with which education was invested in, and the uses to which education was put. All right, so that's a sort of a background I want you to keep in mind. I'd like to suggest that there were perhaps 3 reform transitions that we can be thinking about. First, the post-colonial system, and as I said, skill building and economic growth and social cohesion were priorities in that phase. Secondly, or moving on, a system for an industrial economy. And a third major transition, building a system for a knowledge economy. But there are many different ways of periodizing, if you like, the period from 1965 to the present. The Ministry of Education's favorite classification is survival, efficiency, ability-driven. I'm not quite sure what the 4th is or whether there is a 4th, or ability-driven is going to go, straight down the line into the future. But values, the new minister has been very outspoken about the need for values and citizenship education and character education. So maybe that is a phase. But That's one periodization. Another way of thinking about it was that we were a port city. We were a naval base, right? And then we became an industrial city. And now possibly a knowledge city. We have aspirations to be a global city, a smart city, if you like. All right, so there are different ways of thinking about that evolution over the 50 years and how those major economic transformations had an impact on education and directed the way in which education policies were formulated. I just want to, as an aside, point out about this notion of the port city. How many of you know this book? This is secondary one history textbook. It is important and significant in my view for two reasons. Any teachers from the school system here? Yeah. Seen this book? Do you teach history, social studies? All right. So what do you think is the significance of this?
It's very clinical. And,
very sorry?
It's very clinical.
Okay.
And it just glosses over certain issues.
Okay. All right. So that's one perspective of it. You at least had a chance to look at the book. Anyone else has seen this book? Hello. You're interested in education. You ought to know all these things. For me, it's interesting for two things. 1300 to 1975. I was brought up thinking that we were mudflats before 1819. But we were significant in the 1300s. Now, is this a new discovery? Well, archaeological remains, yes, it's a new discovery. But even if you had a few broken porcelain shards, could you push back history so far back without some conscious decision to push history back? So what does 1300 signal? What could it signal? For me, it could signal, hey, we were always here before 1819. We were important before 1819. We were part of the region before 1819. Those are very important, significant statements to make in the context where Singapore has always been perceived to be not a very good neighbor, but but we always talked about the world being our hinterland, not quite ASEAN. So for me, that title is significant. I'm waiting for secondary 2 textbooks to see what new ideas that might be there. But another thing about this, and this will sort of presage what I'm going to say later about pedagogy, it's a very interesting book in terms of pedagogy, because the whole positioning of how students study in terms of the 21st century competencies is expressed here. It is largely about using original source material and asking students to come to decisions about certain events, about the interpretation of certain events based on what the source data says and why they agree with one source, one interpretation, rather than the other. So in pedagogic terms, and perhaps in socio-political terms, a very important education initiative that is bound up in a textbook, which we very often take for granted. Okay. So those are the basic transitions. So post-colonial, 1965 to 1978, most of you know, unifying, centralizing the system, expanding educational opportunity, building social cohesion. But let's problematize 1965, because we take that as the beginning. I'd like to suggest there's another year in the mid-1950s that was equally significant in educational terms. Anyone have an idea what I'm talking about? Specifically 1956. Perhaps the most important educational document to arise in the post-war period. Anyone? Right. The all-party report on Chinese education. Why was that significant? Because essentially, that was the first national or local effort to address the problems of education and medium of instruction and what to do with multilingualism in a plural society. And the formula that was derived, 4 national languages, so official languages, 1 national language, is essentially what we have today. Right? It was a significant socio-educational settlement. And the consequences is it gave rise to the type of bilingualism we have in our schools today. You ask many school teachers and many others, do you remember 1956? Unfortunately, they don't. We are very ahistorical. We live in the present and the future, but I think it's very important for us to remind ourselves of the past and the key elements of the past, okay? So I think 1956 is important, but essentially what we were able to do, and I think we have one key feature, the capacity of our government to both make plans and to implement it. I've studied comparative education for over 40 years now. There is no dearth of capacity to make policies in the present time. There's a huge lack of ability to implement the policies that have been decided. And so Singapore was able to make that transition from about 1956 till about the end of the 1970s and really have a fairly modern system emerge with growth, complete primary education achieved, with a diversified secondary education, less effort on in terms of polytechnics or universities, but a good solid system which was very primed for the industrial economy that was beginning to emerge as a result of Jurong. The first consequence of thinking politically about education, that model of bilingualism, which was implemented in the 50s and 60s, was far too demanding on the students. It made political sense to say 4 official languages, 1 national language. It made good sense. Intuitively, it's incorrect to say we should have English and a second language, except that we chose English and either Mandarin or Tamil or Malay. Less problems with Tamil and Malay, but with Mandarin and with English, enormous problems, because English was not the language commonly used at home, and Mandarin was not the language commonly used at home, it was dialects. And so children coming to school, day 1, primary 1, first class, 2 foreign languages. Goh Keng Swee in his report in 1978 said it's an absurd system. It is a system made by very intelligent people, and my point here would be that we need to think carefully about the education initiatives that we put forward, because the consequences down the line are enormous. All right? So the second transition is really a transition from about 1979 onwards. In 1979, because that was the report that basically identified the huge burdens that the bilingual policy of the 60s and 70s was imposing on children. Attrition was high, and students hated the language that they were supposed to love, because this was their mother tongue. One could say English was a utilitarian language, it didn't belong to any one of us, study it because it is good for your economic prospects. But you should love your mother tongue because it identifies you as a person of the ethnic group that you're supposed to belong to. Your traditions, your values, your axioms, your proverbs are all in that language. By and large, children hated it because it was so difficult, because they were not prepared and there was not the home support that was available. So the basic policy decision made in the Go report, which is something that we continue with and inherit, is the decision to stream. So streaming, as with bilingualism, these have been the 2 major features of our education system from that period, which still continue to this day. They're not exactly the same, obviously. There have been many, many changes, but essentially, bilingualism and streaming are fundamental to the way we characterize our education system. And when some others look at it And when the ministry gives briefings, it is about, oh, we are a bilingual education system. We are a system that tracks according to ability so that we can provide the best options curriculum-wise for the students, okay? So this period from 1979 to perhaps, well, officially again 1997. But I think even that is problematic because I think 1987 is a better date when we want to think about the response to globalization rather than 1997, and I'll explain why. But I think, relatively speaking, we've had two major policies, bilingualism and streaming, and they've had enormous consequences on the system, but also in other criteria, a fairly rigorous system, well-designed syllabi, well-trained teachers, a commitment to rigor and high standards, which you couldn't say of many systems in the post-colonial era in many other countries. And I think Singapore stands apart in that, okay? What are the challenges that face us today? Before I forget, 1987 or 1997. Everybody knows 1997 because Mr. Goh Chok Tong gave that famous speech, Thinking Schools, Learning Nation. But why could we not argue that 1987 was really the first response to the globalization issue? What happened in 1987? Anyone remember? Sorry? Recession? No, I'm thinking of an education policy or an education event. You know, Singapore's, sorry?
The Chinese university.
1987, no, that was much earlier. Well, it's important to remember reports because the dates of the reports go together. So 1956, all-party report on Chinese education. 1979, the Go report, which introduced streaming. 1987 was when we created, through that report, Towards Excellence in Schools, the independent schools, which remain to this day. That's an important day, keep in mind. Why was that important? Because independent schools were supposed to have a greater degree of autonomy, right? And you contrast that degree of autonomy with a fairly standardized system that had emerged by 1979. And the standardized system had emerged because the previous inherited was completely segregated schooling, right? Hence this argument, how do you build a national system of education? My contention would be that we had built a national system of education by 1987, but had begun the process of differentiation within the national system at that point in time. A second point as to why 1987 is important is that devolution basically is a feature in the economic sphere in terms of globalization, because no central authority can dictate the sort of innovation, productivity, new responses to globalization that were desired. So the business world was all about devolution, autonomy, working closer to the ground. In educational terms, it was the Ministry of Education saying to these independent schools and later autonomous schools, even within the broad curriculum that you have a degree of autonomy to enrich the curriculum, to do remedial curriculum, to raise more fees or resources for trips abroad, whatever. You could even hire your own teachers above quota, provided you are able to pay for them. So I think 1987 is a very important date, and as I talk a bit later, you will find why I think it's very significant, because it started a trend that I think we are beginning to pay a heavy price for. Okay, so 1987, 1997, and essentially, what are the challenges of globalization? In the economic sphere, and you all know it from the budget and all the conversations that have been going on last year and this year, economic restructuring. Very painful for those who suffer the consequences of economic restructuring. Innovation, disruptive innovation is basically changing old patterns of economic activity and creating new ones. People are talking about, well, we no longer need postmen, right? Do we need taxi drivers in the future when you have driverless cars? When you have the Internet of Things? When you have 3D printing? Would you need DIY shops? I mean, everything is being disrupted, right? So the economic challenge in globalization appears to be, in these circumstances, how do you remain competitive? Fundamentally a big challenge, whether you're developed or developing, right? 2-3 years ago, unemployment problem in America was as serious as the problem in the Middle East, as serious in many other countries. It's not as if there's not enough jobs, but there's a disconnect between the skills and the knowledge that school leavers have and the jobs and the knowledge that is demanded by employers. So, can we build and sustain a high skills, high wage economy, which is important for Singapore? Second, as a result of the global movement of talent, of the recruitment of very able and bright people to spur the economy, societies that were diverse are becoming even more diverse. It's no longer unusual to see in Singapore classrooms a large number of children, the children of parents who are permanent residents. What does that raise? What consequences does that raise for how we think about what history should we be teaching? What second language will they offer? Should they also stand up and owe allegiance to the flag and the pledge? It's not longer so straightforward as to what constitutes the Singapore polity at this point in time, when you have a large percentage of people and children in schools who come from different backgrounds. And I suggest that this has huge implications for education and the training system. You know, this is basically some graphic ways of talking about the knowledge economy and the building of knowledge capital, not just adding value, but creating value, which means that R&D is going to be important, and the capacity to do R&D is going to be important. So my question then would be, what policy and pedagogic changes are required for regimes of order, discipline, compliance to give way to regimes of creativity, spontaneity, inclusiveness? Because that's the new challenge. And the consequences of policy choices in favor of choice and competition and differentiation. Because increasingly, the Singapore education system appears fragmented, but fragmented in a different sort of way from it was in the 50s and 60s, when you have Chinese medium schools, English medium schools, Tamil medium schools, and Malay medium schools. Right? It was differentiated on the basis of medium of instruction. The present system seems differentiated with IP schools, with independent schools, with autonomous schools, with schools for students who are underperforming. You look at St. Andrew's Village, for example, another sort of, the configurations are very different. And the key argument for those configurations are, well, we want flexibility, we don't want rigidity in a standardized system. We want flexibility, we want responsiveness, we want multiple pathways. On the face of it, these all seem to be important and viable defenses of differentiation. But I think we should stop and pause and think about the consequences for these multiple pathways. What does it mean to have these multiple pathways and differentiation and still talk about a national system of education? Does it have any salience, a national system of education? Two prime ministers. I was reflecting on whether I should put up these pictures. One of the things about Singapore education is how significant it is in the political space. Well, I put these pictures up when I was thinking about it, that Gopinathan was responsible for Thinking Schools, Learning Nation, and Lee Hsien Loong was responsible for Teach Less, Learn More. But Mr. Tharman was a Minister for Education. Admiral Teo Chee Hean was a Minister for Education, and there are 2 DPMs, right? Ho Keng Swee, Singapore's economic and military and other architect, was a Minister for Education. Did you know that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was for a short time Minister for Education? Yes, he was. It would seem that it is a good way to become Prime Minister, or at least DPM, to be a Minister for Education. So what about Mr. Heng? I don't know. Well, maybe not. But the point really is, education is so important and significant that the best brains and most capable people are often tasked to lead it. And we don't think of it in those terms. We say, well, yet another education minister. It is a very significant, and it just struck me this morning when I was looking on my notes, yes, all these people were education ministers, right? In other countries, education ministry is a very important one, largely because of the teachers' union, right? When you have 40, 50,000, 100,000 teachers who belong to unions, and if you're an education minister, you make a lot of friends by you know what, okay? But in Singapore, different, but I think it's interesting to be thinking about it, okay? So, what did Mr. Goh Chok Tong and what did Lee Hsien Loong talk about? Basically, Chok Tong is interesting. I just picked up the whole speech. Schools must be centers for questioning and searching within and outside the classroom. And children must be continually pressed to raise questions, accept challenges, to find solutions that are not immediately apparent, to explain concepts, justify their reasoning. It's an entirely different pedagogy that is proposed from the ones that at least I'm used to when I went to school. We were certainly not taught to question. Questioning was a dangerous habit in the school systems that I grew up in, okay? Teach less, learn more is a way of, if you like, operationalizing the vision that Mr. Goh Chok Tong laid out. I said about the social. National education actually predates 1997 by 2 years, right? And national education is about the old question: how can schools build values and citizenship that would be valuable to the society, to the nation to be? It continues to be a major preoccupation even today, right? And of course, the IT master plan, because it was a perception that technology was going to dominate so much of society, so much of economic activity that we needed. But I'm surprised that very late in the day we are talking about children being exposed to coding. In a sense, we didn't tap onto the IT revolution and what that could mean as quickly as we did when we wanted to industrialize, and we basically rammed through a technical and vocational curriculum in all secondary schools. But the IT revolution, we've been a bit behind in terms of programming skills and stuff like that, and that may be something to be thinking about. So if I sum up the period 1987 to 2011, a lot of deregulation and structural change, all right? Independent schools, autonomous schools, IP schools, school cluster, and the key, multiple pathways rather than a 642 rigidity that everybody went through. Pedagogy, thinking schools, learning nation, teach less, learn more, ICT, character and citizenship education, a great deal of emphasis now on ECA, a little bit of assessment reform, not as much as I would like, but that seems to be something which is something yet to be done. And greater capacity building amongst teachers so that they would have the capacity to teach in different ways, to utilize a great deal of the instructional strategies. Capacity is one aspect of it. Without capacity, you obviously cannot teach differently. But you can have capacity and still not teach differently. And that might be worthwhile thinking. What might be institutional features? What might be the culture? What might be the impact of high-stakes examination at primary 6, Sec 4, Pre-U2 that basically constrains it? And I think we need to be concerned when even university students are saying that they go for tuition, right? And that figure of 1 billion, you know, one of the things that we are so conscious of, when I read that figure of 1 billion invested in private tuition, I thought there'd be a huge uproar. But there was no uproar. It's very quiet. It basically disappeared. I suspect because everybody is involved in that 1 million, right? So nobody wants to complain about it. Okay, so we've had the responses to globalization. What can we say about the effects? Now, there's a lot to talk about, but briefly put, I would say that there are two contending narratives. And in the discussion, I'd like to hear your views about what you think or which side you fall. One narrative is a narrative that comes out of PISA and TIMSS and PEARLS, and the McKinsey reports on education, global rankings of how good our talent pool is, how wonderful our workforce is, and so on and so forth. A largely positive narrative about the ways in which the policies have been implemented and the consequences for the policies. But there's another narrative. And the narrative is the narrative of what people who sat in classrooms and looked at the teaching and looked at the pedagogy and the conclusions that they have come to, all right? So keep these two in mind and see which one is, for you, a more plausible explanation of the consequences of the policies that we have adopted. But first, we must give the system its due. I've always been struck by this chart. It's a chart that I use in many of my lectures. It basically shows the extent to which the floor has been raised for all ethnic groups in the Singapore education system, and the extent to which there's been a narrowing of achievement gaps between the four ethnic groups, or the three ethnic groups, right? So a narrowing of achievement levels, but not an elimination of achievement differences. And that's perhaps something to keep in mind. Why would that be so, and what could be done about it? Because we don't want a persistent underachievement by any ethnic group. So the narrower the achievement gap that is possible by our policy, that's what we should aim for in terms of policy. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. So a very impressive statistic. If you look at the next one, a similar story, all right? Overall PSAT pass rates, 97.6% in 2012, 81% in 2012 for O levels, and at A levels, 90%. These are very high performance levels. Those of us who know comparative education systems, particularly urban-centric systems, it's very difficult to get these figures. All right, so it's not, I mean, we might grumble a lot about the stress, the pressure, and at the end of it, in terms of certain benchmarks, Singapore students do extremely well, and as a cohort. All right, so I think that's important. But we still have to ask the question, those are large figures, how well has the Singapore system adjusted to the challenges of globalization? To what extent has pedagogy changed? 1997, we are about, 2 years away from the 20th anniversary. And 20 years is a long time in the life of a system. How much change has there been? Are we satisfied with the change that have been made? Are teachers routinely using a variety of pedagogic strategies? Is there greater student engagement? Is there more experiential learning, more using knowledge to solve problems? Sum it all up. Have we moved sufficiently from a performative to a knowledge-building or transformative pedagogy? Because if you're going to be talking about a knowledge economy, then students have got to be familiar with what it means to be knowledge builders, to search for knowledge, to synthesize knowledge, to critique knowledge, to critique received wisdom. Do we do that sufficiently? You might say, well, maybe not at the elementary level, but at the secondary level and the university level. But if university students are searching after private tuition, then one wonders about what is happening at that level, okay? So I think it's a key question going forward, because to the extent that we succeed to that extent, we will have a population and a labor force capable of coping with all the dilemmas and challenges of globalization, or being able to make our way in the knowledge economy. All right? Now, I will not be able to take you through the research that is currently available. In 2003, the Ministry of Education gave the NIE close to $100 million plus, $100 million plus to do research on what the system is like, what teaching is like in the classrooms. We probably now have the best, the most detailed, the most nuanced database on classroom pedagogy across all the subject domains in our school system. Right? So it's not going to be possible for me to summarize this, but for those of you who are really keen, there is a whole book on it. All right? And it's entitled Globalization in the Singapore Curriculum. And it's an analysis of what happens in the classroom. To summarize briefly, the key findings were that while there's been some movement towards the transformative pedagogy I talked about, it is still very largely performative, very largely transmissive, teacher-dominated, text-dominated, exam-dominated. All right? Across the curriculum, knowledge work in the classroom focuses on basic concepts and skills, drill and practice, and reproduction of knowledge. While there is some knowledge quality work, high-quality knowledge work, it is limited. And across the curriculum, there is limited formative assessment. Everything is seen to be geared towards high-stakes terminal exams. All right? Teachers in Singapore rely on whole class forms of lesson organization and whole class lectures. In the UK, about 60% of all lessons are around group work, sharing, critiquing, talking, conversing. The enacted curriculum in Singapore schools is characterized by limited disciplinarity, a limited focus on advanced concepts, knowledge application, the generation of new knowledge, and a performative pedagogy is still very evident. Right, so we move forward a few minutes. So where's the developmental state now? One of the major achievements of the developmental state in Singapore was the creation of a well-educated, aspirational middle class. Today, everybody is using the word middle class in the context of a sandwich class, right? The very top group takes care of themselves. Increasingly, the bottom group, if you're poor and you're old, you're bonanza time in Singapore, right? In terms of the resource transfers that are being made available. What is going to happen to the middle group? And in many societies, a well-educated, committed, responsible, nation-oriented middle class is core for social stability. If you have the middle class despairing that their children will not have the opportunities that they had, then the society and the nation is in big trouble. All right? So, demand for greater choice, participation, transparency, and accountability, largely the product of education. You give me the tools to think, and I will think. And the answers I come up with may not be official. But that's the price you pay for education. That's a benefit of education, right? That people will question, that people will think in different paradigms and make different choices. The aspirations to be a global city, forget the hinterland, forget Malaysia, forget the region. We are competing with Shanghai, with Hong Kong, with Paris, with London, with New York. But what implications does that orientation to being a global city, a magnet for talent, have on sense of nation, sense of citizenship? What would it have for nation-centric language and citizenship policies? And the labor shortages and low productivity. So I think the middle class is beginning, and Singapore society as a whole is beginning to be very troubled about where we are, what directions we ought to be moving in. And to come back to the original question, what role can education play? Inequality is emerging as a huge concern. So of course true that many societies are facing the scourge of inequality. The US, one of the wealthiest nations in the world, is facing with consequences. But Singapore is both a rich nation, high per capita GDP, as well as high Gini coefficient in terms of inequality, right? Look at social protection. Japan and South Korea spend 19.2% and 8% of GDP respectively on social protection. Singapore spends 3.5%. It'll probably be going up as a result of previous budgets and this budget. But very largely, we underprovide because of a view early on that the state will only do so much, that the community, that the individual must all be responsible to some extent. And the key social policy question is, you can do all that you can to help yourself, but if you still can't help yourself sufficiently, what does the state do? Or what does the state have to do? And so this is Lee Hsien Loong in 2013. Fundamental changes are underway in our society. Our demographics and population mix are shifting. Younger Singaporeans have high aspirations, yet harbor nagging anxieties. Income distribution is widening. We must find a new balance between self-reliance and social support, and our policy process must adapt to this new landscape. So very clearly a recognition on the part of government that new policies and new directions are going to be needed. And so you've seen quite a bit of educational reforms. I mentioned this, I'll come back to this. One of the things that seems to me to have happened since 1987 is that given the importance that the economy had for us as a nation, and the use of education to some extent to meet economic needs, we also borrowed a lot of business practices, if you like, into the education system. School ranking is a classic example, right? It's been commonplace to have rankings of businesses. The Forbes list is there, right? It wasn't very common to list schools by order of their success. There was a huge amount of controversy around school ranking. Critics argued the school ranking, or the supporters argued the school ranking was about knowing how well schools are doing and that it would act as a spur to competition. But the critics of school ranking basically said, well, if you have that as the criteria, well-educated and well-trained principals know how to play the game. What subjects you offer in the examinations, what students you admit into your school, would all be factors they would take into consideration, not the provision of education to every deserving student who applied, but can you contribute to my ranking, right? So this controversy rumbled on, but every minister of education defended it until it couldn't be defended any longer. And so it's basically disappeared. But it left a legacy. At one level, it makes sense to talk about competition between schools. But at another level, excessive competition basically means it perverts and distorts the course of education. And today, this whole notion of elite schools, of social exclusiveness in some schools, is a problem that we have to deal with, right? Okay, so three major problem areas as I see it. We go back to 1956 and a view of language, and a view of language and identity that I think was reductionist. If you're Indian, speak Tamil. If you're Chinese, speak Mandarin. If you're Malay, speak Malay. And English belongs to nobody. It's purely an economic language. No cultural value that you will basically ascribe to it. Well, it may, I'm not defending it, but obviously some intelligent people decided that was the way we should understand language, ethnicity, and identity relationships. My point is, to some extent, we have such an entrenched view of bilingualism. Is it even possible to ask fundamental questions about where does bilingualism go over the next 50 years? Our language, our linguistic landscape is changing, has changed. I mentioned earlier about children of PRs. They bring different home languages, which will have no place in school. And yet we want some of them to be citizens. We can only have them citizens if we respect their language, their own linguistic heritage, as much as we respect our linguistic heritage. All right? So, how do we need to be thinking about this? English has become, paradoxically, the de facto national language. We don't use the national language label to it, but I would argue it is the de facto national language. Many of you old enough to know that in the old days, you went to a taxi or a food court. If you thought the person didn't know English, you switched to Malay. Today, we don't use that. We use English. English has replaced Malay as the lingua franca. And yet, Malay is a very important, significant regional language. On purely economic grounds, every child ought to be exposed to Malay. Right? But where do we start with this now? Because such an entrenched model as to what bilingualism means, English and the mother tongue. English position. What language would a Singapore literature be expressed in? If by definition you mean a national literature that all Singaporeans can access, it'll have to be English. This language that was only an economic language is paradoxically going to become the language through which we become truly Singaporean, because it's the only language in common that we have. Not all have the high levels of proficiency, true, but it is a language that has to now have a cultural content, which was long denied it. Okay? Should the state specify what the mother tongue should be? What business is of the state to say that you should take this language? I would argue that the state has a right to say you should do a second language, but you cannot prescribe it anymore. In an era of hybrid and hyphenated identities, it is just not possible. So I think there's a lot of work to be done with regard. And dialects. When election time comes along, great to use dialects. Otherwise, not allowed. Was it necessary to eliminate dialects to raise Mandarin proficiency? I would like to see the research data that suggests that that is the case. But it was conviction rather than data that drove our policies in a particular direction. Streaming and institutional differentiation. I talked a little bit about this earlier. That we no longer have, in my view, a national system in which all students share a certain common experience. Yes, they have a common curriculum. Yes, they have teachers who are trained with the National Institute of Education. But that's not the only thing about schooling. It's the experiences, it's the relationships, it's the ethos, it's who you sit next to that makes a difference about the quality of schooling. So you can be nominally equal, but you can have fundamentally different schooling experiences. And I like to suggest that this differentiation, these multiple pathways are differentiating. And so I'll go back to the earlier question. What does it mean to say we have a national system of education? Today, schools have what I call reputational capital. You might have the same O-levels, but what school you got your O-levels in will matter. And they will matter increasingly in a competitive environment. Social capital, cultural capital, who you know, who you went to school with. This has been around for a long time, folks, not new. But we may have created the institutional features that is going to make this hugely problematic for us. We know that parents commit resources to education. It follows logically that the more resources families have, the more they are prepared to commit to education. Right? Is it possible to inherit meritocracy? Is it possible that money can buy you academic success? There's a very interesting Economist article that came out recently about hereditary meritocracy. Seems to be a contradiction in terms, but increasingly well-educated parents have well-educated children. Right? Because well-educated parents have higher incomes, more stable social lives, more stable family lives, a greater understanding of the value of education, and the social networks that enable them to act on behalf of their children and therefore to advantage their children. So I think at the level of, I had a couple of phrases about, I'll just talk a little bit about meritocracy. Mr. Tharman had a very nice phrase. He originally contrasted American and Singaporean meritocracy in terms of an exam meritocracy and a talent meritocracy. He has a wonderful phrase now, a meritocracy of skills, not a hierarchy of grades earned early in life. We have heard of compassionate meritocracy, yes? Go Chok Tong. We've heard of continuous meritocracy. I always say when words like meritocracy get hyphenated, we are in big trouble. We are in big trouble, all right? Okay, so I claim that education stratification and social stratification are increasingly twinned. The more meritocratic a system, the greater the chance that educational qualifications become a positional good. High societal inequality advantages those families who can invest in education. So the key question going forward, what policies are required to further equalize education opportunities? This is some of the policy responses that we have had. Continuation of policy responses. We'll talk about it later. So, at the end, the PSAT report showed that the highest performing systems are those that are able to combine equity with excellence. Finland shows what equity and equal opportunity in education can look like. And it is possible to achieve excellence with equity. And my wish, on the 50th year of our anniversary going forward, that we don't have to wait another 50 years for equity and excellence in the education system to be one of those features that we will be very proud of. Thank you.